My trauma as a 5-year-old child is not great in the effect that I was raped or terribly abused. It was simply an example of what Harry Stack Sullivan points out is the child having no way of knowing with foresight that his or her actions would bring on the kind of anxiety producing impact that the parental authority levies at the child. So it doesn't have to be a cigarette being put out on the child's face. It can be something like, in my case, a liberal-minded mother. I say liberal-minded, I mean Dr. Spock, kind of, don't punish your child, don't spank him, all the new thinking for the baby boomers. And my mother exemplified that. It was like I was carried around on a soft pillow for the first 5 years of my life. And then we moved out of a place my parents called Brooklyn, and we were right on the edge of suburban sprawl, and I was facing two small lakes with trees, and it was heaven. I had my dog running alongside of me, and the cattails were way up above. And my sister and I even bonded by being gently scolded by my mother because we used her cutlery to kind of cut away some tree limbs and make a little fort in the acre or so of woods on either side of the lake. And so my sister and I bonded, and it was a warm thing. And I'm running around in the fields with my first pair of long pants, which were very significant to me because I had this placard up on my wall in my own little bedroom, and it was a cowboy, and he had long pants. And as you run around and play, the knees become threadbare. And so my mother called me over one day. She was out in the yard working with a pair of pruning shears. And she says, your pants have holes in them. Let's make them into shorts. And I had my first reaction of where I just said no. And that was the first time I had ever done anything like that. And my mother's eyes widened, and she went into some kind of, I guess the only word psychologically would be hysteria in the Freudian sense. She said, come here, and grabbed me hard, and no one had ever grabbed me hard before. And she stuck the scissors into the threadbare part of the jeans and started cutting. And I said, I hate you. And she looked up in horror and smacked me right here. And so I had said, I hate you, and she smacked me. And while I was thinking, I wish you were dead. And she, in her hysteria, began to go into this automated behavior in which she repeated over and over this mantra. What would the neighbors think? What would the neighbors think of a boy who runs around with holes in his pants? The idea of maybe buying me a new pair of pants and switching that out and cutting them off later was beyond her. I had challenged her authority. Anyway, here I am being humiliated and emasculated, crying in front of the whole neighborhood. And because it was suburban sprawl, there was not many trees in anybody's yards, and I could feel these neighbors whom we must please like watching me behind, windowed eyes. So my last hope is my father. He's going to come home and somehow right all this. He's the heavenly bureaucrat, but what I wound up with was the demonic politician. When he came home, I was 5 years old, but a 5-year-old can have more intelligence than a 55-year-old. And I started telling him my tale of woe, and I could feel him kind of moving along with me. He didn't think it was any big deal to have holes in the knee of your new jeans. It didn't Yeah, I could tell he was tracking right along with me on the logic of this whole thing, but when he heard what happened, now my mother had struck me, he looked up at her and she gave him his marching orders in a few pithy factoids. I won't have my son walking around with holes in his pants. And the guy who was tracking with me before disappeared. And my lights on, nobody home father went, "Oh, yes, you must listen to mommy. Mommy knows best." So I got sold out because my father was enslaved to my mother the way men who like pleasure in life are enslaved to sex by the woman. And also, if he didn't stir up any controversies with her, he could go to the racetrack every single weekend that the horses were running. And so gambling and lovemaking, was his sellout options. It's interesting what Sullivan has to say about this. In our type of society, the following sort of organization, to which all too many analysts refer to as the Oedipus complex, is prone to develop. Instead of an attitude towards the father resembling adult awe or fear or respect or reverence, there grows an attitude of more or less concealed jealousy and hatred. Even more destructive is the situation in which the woman is the boss. In such homes, any possible good which might derive from a benignant matriarchy is utterly swamped in the child's reaction to the woman's effort to be a man, yet conform to society, and the man's effort to protect his self-esteem. When the father is a fanatic from paranoid feelings or whatnot, the matter of wretched adjustment of one to another parent and of one or both to the conventional pattern to which they strive to conform grows more and more important as we try to understand the coming of subsequent disaster to the offspring. When the woman becomes the boss in the household behind a culturally approved facade. We soon are leaving. My father has a doomed import-export enterprise in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and we're on our way to the airport. Now, this is about 6 months to a year after the emasculation. And my stuffed dog, like a teddy bear, we're in the taxi cab on our way to the airport, and I go, "Where's my dog?" And I see the look of horror on my mother's face, and I know right away what's going to happen. She talks to my father. There's no time to turn the cab around and go back for it. And she says to me, "Aunt Cessa will send it to us in Brazil." And at that moment, I ceased to be in that taxi cab. I was in a dream state that's usually referred to as a nightmare, strictly because you have no concept that anything exists outside of the circumstances of the dream. And I wasn't in the cab anymore. There was a figure which was like my Aunt Setsa, which was actually my father's aunt, who only spoke English haltingly. She read the Hebrew newspaper, the Daily Forward, seldom left the house. And I had this image, or this image existed, of her going towards kind of a official-looking storefront with a package under her arm, and which, of course, would have been my stuffed dog, and a voice came out of every atom of that dream. And it said, "You'll never see that again." And it wasn't taunting, it wasn't angry, it wasn't judgmental, but it was very plain. And I wouldn't hear that voice again until I had bottomed out after 12 years of heavy drug use and was in AA, NA, GA, sometimes 3 times a day. But we'll pick this up now. We go to Brazil. My father was not a con man. I mean, he wouldn't hurt other human beings, but he was adept at bribing customs agents to allow Let's say maybe a horse race trainer who didn't have any horses running for him back at Aqueduct Racetrack in New York would come down as a, quote, new immigrant to Rio. And as a new immigrant, you're allowed to bring in one car, one couch, one TV, etc., without having to pay any tariff, any duty tax. Now, if you wanted to bring in a car and sell it, you'd have to pay 100% of the invoice in order to get it into the country. But my father found out by paying the right customs agent, he could have, for example, his friend, African-American part-time racehorse trainer, come down as a new immigrant and brought in a refrigerator that could fit under the length of like the Copacabana Hotel bar. You know, it wasn't a refrigerator like a normal personal refrigerator. It was this industrial sized thing for one of the hotels. And by not having to pay duty tax, my dad could make quite a bit of money. But he had to have that refrigerator sold to somebody who was a Brazilian businessman. So he had a partner in whose name all this merchandise was sitting until we could sell it for a profit to that, for example, hotel. Well, part of the escrow, you might say, in the in between was my dad was given the ownership of an apartment, like a condominium, in this apartment house. And if you know Rio, a lot of them are built on stilts. So the whole apartment house fell down the hill, and my father's partner had a heart attack and died. And his wife was certainly in no hurry to give my father back merchandise. And there's stories of racehorses involved and stuff like that. But anyway, suffice to say, I saw my father melt down in front of me, and we moved from the Copacabana Hotel to like an ordinary apartment. And I remember looking out over the landscape, kind of like the guy in the BB gun Christmas story, where he sees Black Bart coming. Well, I could see quite easily how people could come across and come like practically right up to my window. And I thought I had this itch in my throat. And in order to scratch it, I needed to scream. So I just sat up in bed and started screaming. On my return to Brooklyn, settled in a couple of years, I was around 9 years old, and we heard that this gang from Pigtown or something, we lived in East Flatbush, was coming into our turf that night. And those dynamisms that had been set in motion by my humiliation, my somewhat physical abuse, the sexual symbology of being emasculated with the cutting off of my pants, had stirred up enough resentment that I found myself like a robot leaving my house and going down the street. And here were these gang members. So they took me in the alley and said, "Get on your knees or we'll kill you." And I got on my knees, and the thought entered me, I knew they really weren't going to kill me. Now, for those who say I'm working out my gay inner nature, I would say read the works of Dr. Harry Stack Sullivan, who himself was probably gay, when he says there are some people who are seeking out this homoerotic behavior because it reflects a dynamism of difficulty, such as that tremendous emotional power of the trauma being reflected not in a seeking out of love with another male, but at 9 years of age, I was the vampire's elect, looking to get bitten.